Well, my question for both of you is, I've spent 40 days really trying to understand what the Russians think of what is happening, of what their country is doing in Ukraine. And I accept all the reporting that inside Russia, there's still a lot of support for Putin and a sizable amount of support for what Putin has described as a special operation. I guess my question for you, Tom, is what does this become? How is it not a war if now the two countries engaged in a war are attacking each other inside the other's borders?
I think the most important thing to understand is that the Russians have completely lost their political purpose from the outset, because this war was supposed to be a quick, lightning strike that was going to collapse the government in Kiev. They were going to, have a big parade and replace the government. And once that plan fell through, there wasn't any other plan. And at this point, there isn't one Ukraine operation that the Russians are carrying out. There are several Ukraine operations. There isn't even a unified theater commander in this place. And so some of these, I think, and, trying to second guess what the Russians are doing here, some of these Russian units are just fighting just to stay alive, to hold their position because they don't know what else to do. Some of these Russian units are clearly carrying out orders that are meant to simply punish the Ukrainians for their defiance, even if the Russians can't actually hold that territory. And some of it is just sheer confusion, where they don't know why they're there. They don't know how to get out. They're waiting for more detailed orders and replacements that aren't coming. And so this whole thing is a hot mess from beginning to end. So when you ask what kind of war is this, for the Ukrainians, it's a war of self-defense to restore their sovereignty and to protect their borders. For the Russians, who knows what they're thinking at this point, and whether Vladimir Putin even understands what kind of war he's fighting at this point.
Yeah, I mean, Director Brennan, Tom's getting at, the most cogent analysis of everything we've sort of seen in the headlines this week, sort of from intel reporters and Pentagon reporters. But I guess what isn't clear to me is, does it put him back on his heels? Does it suggest any possibility that he sort of fabricates a pretext to exit, or does it make him more dangerous?
I think probably all of the above. I certainly agree with Tom that this is a very messy and confused battlefield, and there's a fair amount of evidence that the Russians are trying to deal with a situation that continues to unfold in a very bad way for them. And so therefore, I'm sure that Putin and other senior Russian officials, the military, are trying to figure out exactly the way ahead. And so that's why they're sending signals about negotiations and ceasefires, but also, I think, trying to reorient their forces, reposition them, resupply them. I do not believe for one moment that Putin has given up on his objective of actually taking over Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that he has to now deal with the reality on the ground, because he never anticipated, at least in my mind, that after 5 weeks, this would be the situation in Ukraine. I do think he thought that this was going to be a fairly quick exercise and that he would be in control of most of Ukraine by now.
Tom, I want to read some of the reporting that sort of builds into the analysis you've offered, and it's about the lack of a battlefield commander based on our analysis. This is from the Times reporting. The lack of a unifying military leader in Ukraine has meant that Russian air, ground, and sea units are not in sync. Their disjointed battlefield campaigns have been plagued by poor logistics, flagging morale, and between 7,000 and 15,000 military deaths. Senior U.S. officials and independent analysts say it's also contributed to the deaths of at least 7 Russian generals, as high-ranking officers are pushed to the front lines to untangle tactical problems that Western militaries would leave to more junior officers or senior enlisted personnel. For as astute as all of our intelligence has been on the Russian question, is the Russian military worse than anybody thought, or is this just a trial that even the best intel can't predict its outcome? What's your read on this?
Well, it's a little of both of those. I don't think anybody observing the Russian military would have bet on completely staggering levels of incompetence like we're seeing now. But it also tells you that the whole Russian military system, command and control, the way they train, the relationship between their officers and their enlisted people, is just dysfunctional at every level. And when you were reading those figures, Nicole, I just kept thinking, what a staggering amount of losses in 5 weeks. I mean, that's just incredible. And, there's a reason that countries like the United States, I taught our military officers for 25 years, we emphasize things like jointness. We emphasize coordinating our air, ground, sea operations. This is a bunch of kind of independent. You would almost think that all these units attacking Ukraine are all from different countries. They're so poorly coordinated and can't speak the same language. And it is really remarkable. But again, I think the flaw at the heart of it, there were two flaws. One is a lot of people around Putin didn't want to do this and had never really planned for it, despite years of Putin saying he wanted to do it. And also the inability to tell the boss the truth. Mm-hmm. and to have reckoned with this early on, to tell him this is going to be a lot harder than you think it is. And so he said, go in and do it. And they stumbled into it. And now they're in the middle of a complete mess.
Director Brennan, to Tom's point, this figure of 7,000 to 15,000 military deaths, the other piece of that, I think, is a NATO estimate of if those numbers hold or are close, I think 30 to 40,000 Russian soldiers that have been, it would include the number killed, captured or injured. And I wonder if in your mind, with your understanding of sort of the pressure points where they are and are not in Russia, is there a figure where the cost is so high that it changes the support for Putin inside Russia? Or are those frames sort of a Western frame on a autocratic country that doesn't have the same sort of value for life?
Well, I think all authoritarian regimes have their breaking point. And yes, Putin has a tremendous monopoly on political power inside of Russia. But if you bring together the tremendous losses on the battlefield and all of those Russian soldiers who have been killed, together with the economic pressure that it's facing internationally in terms of sanctions, and then the demonstrations and protests in Russia, and if there's going to be some bloody confrontation between security forces and Russian citizens on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg and other things, I think that combination of pressure really does raise questions about the continued viability of the Putin regime. But I do think the humiliation and the destruction of a large part of the Russian military, which I think has demonstrated that it just didn't have that battlefield experience. For better or worse, U.S. military, after decades in Iraq, Afghanistan, really has been able to integrate those capabilities, as Tom said. The Russians never had to face such a hostile environment. There was a 12-day war in Georgia. They walked into Crimea. In Syria, they were basically advising and taking long-range strikes out of missile bases in Russia and the Black Sea. But they never had to confront a hostile and determined and very courageous military like they're facing in Ukraine right now. And so therefore, I think they're trying to figure out exactly how they can salvage something out of what has become really a debacle for them.
Yeah, and, Tom, I want to ask you about the role of propaganda, and even with the close eye I keep on some of those primetime hours on Fox News, I don't consume a lot of Russian propaganda, but even I knew that what Putin was telling his country and ostensibly his military was that they would be greeted as liberators, that people would open their arms, feed the Russian soldiers meals, and be grateful that they were there. Not only has it not happened in the whole of Ukraine, that hasn't even appeared to have happened, or it hasn't happened in any ways that are public-facing in the contested Donbas region. I mean, what does that portend for how this ends?
Well, we want to believe that body bags and returning soldiers who tell stories of what's really going on will affect the home front. Part of the problem is that the average Russian citizen is so cynical and so distrustful of anything that all stories are true and all stories are false. And it may well be that a lot of these, we're already seeing reports that a lot of mothers who are having to bury their sons are angry at the Ukrainians because they believe that somehow the Ukrainians were the aggressors in all of this. What I think is and going back to Director Brennan's point about the stability of the regime, what you're going to get, I think, is a really strong division of opinion between older Russians who support Putin and who will basically shrug and believe or not believe anything they're told, and younger Russians who know how to get on the internet, who know how to follow the news, who are in touch with each other. That this is, you could look at this as the last gasp of the old Soviet or Russian past, and that the people who actually know what's going on, if they have a chance, are the Russian future. But for now, I wouldn't bet on public discontent immediately making Putin pull back. In fact, I'm worried that he will lash out and do something really dramatic as a way of trying to shore up the home front and to put some spine into his men out in the field.
Well, I have to ask you then, Director Brennan, to give us a last word on whether that explains the real public concerns about whether or not he would use a chemical weapon.
Well, I don't think he wants to escalate with chemical or tactical nuclear at this time, because I think he's trying to still win this war with conventional military capabilities. If he does do that, and I do agree, it would be a potential indication that he is pursuing a more reckless path here going forward. It's very worrisome from the standpoint of how that could quickly escalate. And I do think the United States and NATO could not stand idly by while he uses these WMD capabilities inside of Ukraine. I do think that there would have to be some type of response. And I'm very glad to hear that the United States and NATO are planning for such a potential eventuality, even one that might not be at this point a likely course.